A Critical History of the DSA. In this presentation, we'll be talking about the DSA's history, mostly of the founders and the organizations that were key to the development and eventually the evolution and establishment of the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. We'll be splitting this presentation up into three sections. Section one will be talking about the founders and predecessors, the early organizations. In section two, we'll be discussing anti-communism in the early history of the DSA. And section three, we'll be talking about the realignment strategy in action. Section one, DSA founders and predecessors: Michael Harrington, DSA, Dorothy Healy, and NAM.
So the immediate circumstances of the DSA's formation was a merger between the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, DSOC, and the New American Movement, NAM, at the first DSA convention. The convention had been planned as a unity convention held on March of 1982. Their ideological points of unity were over the democratic road to socialism, opposition to communism, and adherence to a strategy of realigning the Democratic Party. These still represent some fundamental ideological principles that characterize DSA as a whole, at least on a national level. And to examine the origins of these fundamental principles, we need to look at the roots of the organization by looking at its founders and the organizations that make it up.
Michael Harrington was perhaps the most central figure in the early history and founding of the DSA. So Michael Harrington was an activist, he was an intellectual, and an organizer. He was often at the center of the Socialist Party and its affiliate organizations throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and up to the 1970s. The center of his political life and his driving force was the realignment, an idea that we'll be developing further and discussing in much more detail down the line. So realignment, without getting too bogged down in it, is the aim of bringing about meaningful social change and welfare by working with and within the Democratic Party apparatus, with the goal of transforming the party into the Workers' Party of the United States, in essence. So Michael Harrington was born and raised in St. Louis by a Catholic family, and his first inroads to his political life was through the Catholic workers' movement of Dorothy Day. It was in the Catholic workers' movement in the 1950s, and also through college, where he developed his political identity. Though he eventually became disillusioned with the Catholic workers' movement in his youth, he also became more broadly disillusioned with Catholicism and came into a crisis of faith, though he remained, I believe, a Christian throughout the rest of his life. So after he left or departed the Catholic workers' movement, Harrington became, in the 1950s, he became involved with the Trotskyist-inspired organization, the Independent Socialist League of the ISL, which was also an affiliate, or at least tangentially related to the Socialist Party of America. Max Chapman was the founder of the ISL, and also the mentor of Michael Harrington, speaking with Harrington and developing a relationship with him, the two developed the idea of the realignment, refined the idea, and essentially became allies within the organizations that they were involved with throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Ultimately, Chapman and Harrington did have a falling out over some issues in the late 60s, but Harrington nonetheless considered him to be a valuable mentor and even dedicated some of his works to Chapman. Yeah, he even considered, or jokingly said later in his life, like, I was more of a Chapmanite than Chapman himself. So Michael Harrington, after he was part of the ISL in the 1960s, that's when he rose to national prominence when he published the book The Other America, an expose essentially on poverty, or the experience of poverty in America at the time. This book became widely circulated enough nationally that it came across JFK and LBJ. LBJ was moved enough, or at least interested enough in Michael Harrington's book, that he invited Michael Harrington to be a part of the War on Poverty programs. Although Harrington ultimately was disappointed with the scope and scale of the War on Poverty programs, he did ultimately see them as a positive step, and did his best to maintain influence and allyship with the LBJ administration. In the 1960s, in addition to his work in publishing The Other America, Harrington also came to sharp blows with over the Vietnam War issue with his fellow socialists. Specifically, he refused or was very opposed to the idea of organizing with any members who would bring Viet Cong flags to protest, or who did not sufficiently denounce the North Vietnamese movement, as he saw their revolutionary movement as inevitably leading to Stalinist totalitarianism. So it was over this issue of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement that Harrington ultimately came to leave the Socialist Party entirely. And in the early 1970s, he went on to form DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. So DSOC was the organization that Michael Harrington was worked in from 1973 up until 1982. Throughout this time, ultimately 1982, DSOC and NAM realized their visions were more or less aligned and merged into the organization that we know now as the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. So Michael Harrington remained as chairman of the DSA from 1982 until his passing in 1989. What Michael Harrington summed up his political views throughout his life was left wing of the possible. He always he viewed revolutionary movements such as the USSR at the time and Cuba as ultimately totalitarian, and viewed the path towards socialism in the United States as ultimately through the path of the realignment. Through the realignment, which we have discussed and we'll discuss in more detail, it's ultimately a strategy of working with and within the Democratic Party to turn it into the Workers' Party of the United States. I will let Michael Harrington speak very well for himself, his thesis.
But why then do I still, as I do, work within the Democratic Party? Why did I go to Atlanta? Why do I think that this party is the way to go? Why don't I support the notion of a third party that would really say what it meant, come up with a program for the economic and social crisis of our time, and deal with the issues? And the reason is simply this, that in the crazy politics of the United States, you have a Democratic Party which contains some of the worst people in the country, some of the outstanding racists, sexists, union busters, cold warriors, and God knows what else are in the Democratic Party. At the same time, that same party contains most of the best people. And if you say this is a contradiction, this is an impossibility, this is something that shouldn't happen, I couldn't agree more. The problem is, this is America. This is what we get out of our structures, out of our party system. I believe that we have to change the party system. I believe that the kind of issues that are going to be on the agenda in the future are such that we're going to have to really face up to issues. But how do you change it? And I think the way you get a new party in the United States, ironically, is not through starting one. The last time that was done, more or less, was the Republican Party in the 1850s. The way you get a new party in the United States is by transforming an old party.
So before Harrington was the face of DSA, he had been the founding chairman of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, or DSOC, which we had already mentioned. But to speak more on DSOC, it had its origins in the Socialist Party / Social Democratic Federation, or SP-SDF, a merger of the Socialist Party of America and a group that had previously split off from it called the Social Democratic Federation. For all intents and purposes, the SP-SDF was just another incarnation of the SPA. The immediate circumstances of DSOC's formation were that SP-SDF was holding its regular convention, and the year was 1972. That convention was characterized by a bitter struggle over some fundamental ideological, political, and strategic questions. One of those was the party's stance on the war in Vietnam. Harrington led a faction that opposed the war and wanted the party to call for the withdrawal of troops, while the majority faction at the convention opposed it. The convention would also result in a name change for the organization. It would end up being called Social Democrats USA, or SDUSA. So prior to the convention, Harrington had already resigned from his post as honorary chairman. And after the convention, he and his followers resigned en masse from the SPSDF, which at that point was SDUSA. And Harrington had resigned via a letter to the National Committee of the organization. And in that letter, he made the following statement, which is pretty revealing to his general ideological outlook. And the statement reads, "The broad framework of my analysis of communism as a bureaucratic collectivist system that is both anti-capitalist and anti-socialist is the same as that of the present leadership of SDUSA. But as a socialist, I believe that communism must be countered by democratic alternatives, not by the dictatorial regimes America has backed in Saigon." And at the very start of DSOC, of its existence, we could see that it was characterized by this realignment strategy that we've been talking about, trying to turn the Democratic Party into a workers' party. And we can see evidence of this in the first issues of DSOC's newsletter, Democratic Left. The following quotes are all from the first issue. So this is from Harrington, and it says, quote, "We believe that the left wing of realism is today found in the Democratic Party. It is there that the mass forces for social change are assembled." So again, this is repeating a lot of what he said in the previous video, but this was in writing in the Democratic Left. And the following was by another founding member of DSOC called Hugh Cleland. And it reads, quote, "The Democratic Party is changing. The McGovern reforms have opened the party to young people, Blacks, women, working people in unprecedented fashion. Power relationships will never be the same. Neither will the party long remain as it is today," unquote. So that goes to show the optimism that existed at the time in DSOC, in the 70s around changing the Democratic Party. Another aspect of DSOC that's important to note was its relationship to organized labor. And early on, it had some very, very strong inroads into organized labor and the AFL-CIO through this de facto DSOC bloc that was formed. And what basically allowed that to happen was that there was a lot of DSOC-friendly top leadership in unions such as United Auto Workers and AFSCME, which I think is American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So there was Doug Fraser from UAW and Jerry Werf from AFSCME that were pretty critical in allowing DSOC to have some influence and say in organized labor. However, it's not clear in our research exactly how that was leveraged.
Dorothy Healy. I think Dorothy Healy is an incredibly fascinating figure. Her incredibly long life spanned some of the most pivotal moments in the history of the American left in the 20th century. In her, I think we can see the arc of the American labor movement, from its radical beginnings to its ultimately rather de-radicalized ends towards the latter half and end of the 20th century. Dorothy Healy was born to an early CPUSA member in 1914. She could be considered what was referred to as a red diaper baby. She was radicalized by her experiences in the Great Depression. She joined the Young Communist League and became an active labor organizer, particularly of agricultural workers throughout the 1930s and the early 1940s. That's where she spent most of her time as a labor organizer. She was on the forefront of many of the openly communist and radical labor organizing efforts. And it was for her radicalism and for her open political views and self-described communism that Dorothy Healy was ultimately targeted by the state projects that were aimed at removing the radical elements from labor organizing. So in the 1940s, while she was working with the CIO to organize the farm workers, she was targeted for arrest primarily for being an openly communist union organizer. These arrests aimed to stymie her development within the organizing movement, and it wasn't just her. I believe she's emblematic of her time. Many labor leaders who were openly radical were removed from leadership positions, or were imprisoned, or targeted with lawsuits, and often with rather, let's say, dubious implementations of due process. There's an anecdote of one of Dorothy Healy's hearings in which the judge was taken outside by the prosecutor, and the prosecutor and the judge, when they entered together again, delivered the sentence immediately to have Dorothy sent to jail. In 1945, she resigned from the CIO to work full-time for the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States of America. She remained in the CPUSA for a few decades. So she was charged with conspiracy to violently overthrow the US government in 1951 as part of the Red Scare, which was the Red Scare was not just a reaction that came out of nowhere in the American political scene at the time, but was used as a political tool to exculpate any radical elements from Hollywood to especially the labor movement, and Dorothy Healy was wrapped up in this crackdown. So despite her ardent communism, however, she became disillusioned with actually existing socialism after hearing Khrushchev's speech in the late 1950s. When Stalin passed away in 1953, he was shortly thereafter succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev in 1956 delivered a speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, detailing many of the abuses and excesses of the Stalin regime. This speech worldwide had the effect of splintering many communist parties, not just in America, but ultimately leading to many of these communist organizations splitting over whether or not to continue following the Moscow line, so to speak. Dorothy was appalled by the details in Khrushchev's secret speech, and before this, this started the thread in her opposition to actually existing socialism, though she never described herself as anything other than a communist. She still remained in the CPUSA until the the early 1970s, actually, though she resigned from leadership positions in the CPUSA after Brezhnev's invasion of the Czechoslovakia in 1968, and eventually left the CPUSA entirely in 1973. After her departure, she joined the New American Movement, which was formed at that time, NAM, which ultimately merged with DSOC of Michael Harrington to form the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982, which she was involved in the 1980s, although she retired mostly in the 1990s and passed away in the 2000s.
There. If you have questions for Dorothy Healy or for myself, or you have comments or statements to make about what we're talking about lesbian, gay liberation and socialism, please call in 985-5735, 985-KPFK.
And here's a call, Josie. Let's go on. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, what about the other question of can there be gay liberation within this society?
Whoa, I'm sorry, I forgot that part. That's the problem, the aging problem, I call that, where you don't remember everything that's asked. I don't think there can be full gay liberation, no, gay or lesbian liberation under capitalism, any more than I can think there can be the full liberation of any other sector of society. And part of the reason for that is that the kind of schooling, the kind of training, the kind of socializing of human beings in regard to the general subject of human sexuality is always, I think, going to be dominated by what in Marxist language we would call bourgeois ideology.
Most so-called socialist systems have done worse on this issue than even capitalist systems have. I know China and Cuba and Russia have abominable records on the issue of homosexuality. How do you deal with that?
Their attitude toward not just the questions of gay and lesbian rights, and you are right, they are incredibly backward on those questions, but human sexuality generally, they're very backward at. They simply are not models. They are not models as far as political democracy is concerned. They are not models in any respect on that. So that I say it's part and parcel of a backwardness that obviously would not be the vision of anyone who is looking for a socialist America to have. I should also.
The New American Movement, or NAM, was an organization that had emerged out of the Students for a Democratic Society, out of its collapse towards the end of the 60s. And in a lot of ways, the way it the shape it ended up taking organizationally, ideologically, was in response to a lot of the perceived excesses in SDS. So there was this turn towards a quote unquote progressive patriotism as a form of correcting SDS's anti-Americanism. This took a lot of inspiration from the Popular Front years of the 1930s in the communist movement. It also, for instance, its stance towards the labor movement was more of celebrating or taking a more passive stance towards the existing union leadership and existing labor unions rather than the extremely hostile stance that SDS took towards the concept of the labor aristocracy. Another thing about NAM was that it had absorbed many disillusioned communists that ended up leaving CPUSA, especially as a lot of the younger students or youth that made up NAM would start drawing in older communists that they knew were disillusioned with the CPUSA. So for instance, Dorothy Healy was recruited into NAM by her son, who had been a member of SDS previously. So because of this, because of the way that they decided to organize, they ended up becoming very ideologically eclectic and varied. Early on, for instance, there was a very strong trend within the organization that reflected a lot of the new communist movement that existed in the 60s and 70s. These people in the articles of the official New American Movement newsletter would advocate for the construction of a revolutionary vanguard party. However, this was ultimately defeated. And then, according to Jack Ross, a historian who wrote The Socialist Party of America, A Complete History, he quotes this about the ideological character of New American Movement. So, quote, as it happened, by the late 1970s, NAM effectively became the American branch of the Euro-communist phenomenon. How profound a change this was for the movement that began with the Port Huron Statement. So again, this is a similar case to something that was happening in the European communist movement and socialist movement of a turn towards a more eclectic and sort of nationally oriented form of socialism. So one main point of demarcation that existed between NAM and DSOC early on was the issue of Israel-Palestine, where NAM was advocating for the recognition of the PLO, while DSOC maintained a more Zionist position. And this led to the formation within DSOC of a committee against the NAM merger in 1979. And eventually during the merger, to basically allow it to happen, the position that was taken as a compromise in the early DSA was the support for negotiations with the PLO, while still being explicitly committed to supporting American military aid to Israel. So one thing that needs to be noted between DSOC and NAM is that they share a common ideological or a common organizational thread with the Socialist Party of America, which, the SPA was a socialist party in the United States formed in 1901 from as a split from the oldest socialist party in the United States, the Socialist Labor Party of America. That one was founded in 1876. However, it failed to become rooted in the working class. It was very sectarian, and eventually this failure would lead to a split within the SLP. And that split would be what eventually came to form the SPA. However, by 1936, the SPA had already gone into stagnation and decline. There was decreasing membership, it had dwindling influence in trade unions, and electorally, it was not doing as well as it had previously. It was slowly dwindling in its influence, over the compared to even 10 years prior. So throughout 1901 to 1936, the party was also very ideologically varied and split into different camps. Most of these camps started to gravitate around two poles. One of them being the left wing that advocated for class struggle, and the need for revolution, and the right wing that argued mostly for reforms, a primarily electoral strategy, and basically a slow transition into socialism. So William Z. Foster, who was a member of the SPA, wrote an analysis on the decline of the SPA called Crisis in the Socialist Party, which he wrote in 1936. So in his analysis, the main reason for the failure of the SPA was its adherence to a policy of reformism instead of one of Marxist class struggle, which he said came from the domination of the petty bourgeoisie and intellectuals in the party and the lack of a solid proletarian base in leadership. So these intellectuals strove to create a progressive party of reforms. And what this led to was that the party never came forward militantly as the leader of the working class. It never led the daily economic and political struggles of the workers. And by not doing that, it failed to revolutionize the workers and to bring their level of militancy and understanding of how to create socialism. They failed to bring it to a higher level. It failed to ideologically develop Marxist understanding of class struggle among its own members and among the party's mass following. And also its leadership would persecute the left wing of the party and many of the working class members in the party who represented some of its most ardent militants, party builders and trade unionists. Some of the people who had the strongest ties with the working class were all expelled. And this weakened the rank and file base of the party and discredited it greatly among its following. So, without that following, without those party builders, the party fell into stagnation and decline. And so with its political failures mounting and the ideological rift within the organization growing, the SPA began to hemorrhage members and suffer from continuous splits, from the 1912 split, which was relatively small, which William Z. Foster was a part of, to the much larger national split in 1919 over the question of the Russian Revolution. After that, still the SPA continued to split until it basically ceased to exist as the SPA, which we argue could be around the time of the formation of STUSA and DSOC. That's around the time that you could kind of argue that the SPA proper no longer really existed. So the question, I guess, is why is this relevant to a study of DSA and its history? So the SPA served as a large historical inspiration for both of the organizations who would come to form DSA, both DSOC and NAM, and at the very convention where DSA was formed, there was a lot of homages to the SPA. So for instance, the official dinner event of the first convention was called the Debs-Thomas Dinner, which, Debs being a very famous presidential candidate of the SPA and member of the SPA, and Thomas being a more, long-standing, not as famous, but he had been around for a long time, leading member of the SPA. And also at that dinner, they were giving out like a Debs-Thomas Award. And it's not just these things that are mostly window dressing that served as evidence for this nostalgic look at the SPA. Shortly after the first convention, two founding members of DSA, who had been members of NAM, wrote in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette the following. So, quote, DSA, which was founded last month with the merger of the New American Movement and the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, plans to bring socialist politics to mainstream America. DSA members claim a lineage to the rich tradition of American radicalism portrayed in Warren Beatty's Reds. Our movement seeks to emulate the broadly based appeal of the old Socialist Party of America. Before 1920, that party had a profound influence on the reformers and reforms of the day. In 1912, for instance, some 1,200 Socialist Party members held elected office from coast to coast, among them 79 mayors in 24 states. Unquote. So we'd argue that this led the early DSA down much the same road as the SPA. A lot of the same strategic lines and a lot of the same ideological positions were carried over or never really went away and through the existence of SPA to the organizations that would come to form DSA. So that includes the predominance of the electoral strategy, advocating for the democratic road to socialism, anti-communism, and a generally passive and tailist attitude to the labor movement. And these nostalgic attitudes to SPA come from mostly the direct historical ties that DSA and its precursor organizations have to the party, which should be highlighted, and we'll do that right now by showing a chart of these ties. So in this chart, you can kind of see, it could look a little complicated, but basically from the SPA to the DSA, there's kind of these two threads, which is like the Socialist Party formations, which are at the top and in red, and then like the youth organization formations, which are more youth-based, more around colleges and universities. And at every step, these kind of interact with each other, which is what the yellow arrows are. But to explain a little better, the Socialist Party of America was formed at the beginning of the 20th century, and it had as its unofficial youth wing the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, or the ISS. And that yellow arrow is just to represent this relationship that the SPA would help the ISS, and ISS members would go on to be members of SPA and so on. However, within the SPA, eventually there was a split between some members who would then form the Socialist Democratic Federation. However, they would come together back into the Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation. The ISS would also change and become the League for Industrial Democracy. And then that would go on to become Students for Democratic Society. All the while, Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation was still in contact with that same lineage of youth organizations. So SPSDF was still working within LID and was working within SCS. And there was also some clashes between the two of them because there's some ideological variation, but because there was even overlap in members, I mean, Harrington was involved in LID and SDS while still being a member of SPSDF. These differences would go on to be smoothed out as SDS became NAM, and once Harrington split off and formed DSOC, so Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And around here, DSOC members and NAM members still in contact with each other and coming to greater and greater ideological and political unity. And then that is when they go on to form Democratic Socialists of America. So from here, you could see that through both currents, there was a pretty, maybe not totally direct, but there is this ideological or organizational lineage between these organizations.
What's up, everyone? My name is Benjamin Calvete, and in this part of the presentation on the critical history of the DSA, I will be presenting section 2, which deals with anti-communism in the early DSA, which finds its origins in the League for Industrial Democracy, the Students for a Democratic Society, and the Socialist Party. Michael Harrington, the person who was previously mentioned by or introduced by Comrade Austin, was a member of the Socialist Party of America, an important one at that, and also a very important member of the League for Industrial Democracy. So anti-communism in the origins of the DSA can be found first in this squabble between the League for Industrial Democracy and the Students for a Democratic Society. So the SDS drafted a statement where they denounced the USSR. And in that statement, more specifically, it's named the Port Huron Statement, the SDS condemned communism. And it was a statement that Harrington participated in drafting as a member of LID, which at the time was the parent organization of the SDS. So the statement reads, "As Democrats, we are in basic opposition to the communist system. The Soviet Union as a system rests on the total suppression of organized opposition. The Communist Party has equated falsely the triumph of socialism with centralized bureaucracy. The Soviet state lacks independent labor organizations and other liberties we consider basic. Communist parties throughout the rest of the world are generally undemocratic in internal structure and mode of action. The communist movement has failed, in every sense, to achieve its stated intentions of leading a worldwide movement for human emancipation. So in this statement, right, one of the two core fundamentals of Harrington's political strategy were present, right? And that core fundamental was anti-communism, right? Here they denounce the Communist Party, right, of the Soviet Union, and they denounce communist parties around the world in general, stating that they're, quote, undemocratic, right? And they, on top of that, they say the communist movement has failed, right, to lead in this movement for human emancipation. So the sentiments of anti-communism that Harrington was a huge proponent of were there, right? However, where there was a lot of disagreement between Lid and the SDS, right, was that the SDS rejected the logic of anti-communism, right? And that's the logic that the U.S. stands for, liberal democratic values, while the Soviet Union and communist countries stands for totalitarianism. And the SDS didn't believe in that logic. It's kind of obvious, but it was because the U.S. has does use that rhetoric and that narrative that they're proponents of democracy and freedom and liberty as a mechanism to carry out imperialism, more specifically against the third world. And so they rejected that, right? They knew that it was just the U.S.'s form of a propaganda war, to smear communism for its own project, which the SDS rejected, right? And so on top of that, Harrington, he was such a vehement anti-communist that he was indignant over the seating of Jim Hawley, an observer on behalf of the Communist Party, at the conference, right, at the retreat. He left due to this Communist Party observer at the conference, and the SDS had even kicked out that observer after Harrington had left, right, to please him, to get him to come back, and the rest is history, right? So Harrington, vehement anti-communist, and the organization that he was a part of at the time, LID, the League for Industrial Democracy, even compared communists to Nazis. So you could really see how his anti-communism, his logic of anti-communism, was very similar to that of the anti-communist propaganda being espoused by the U.S. State Department, right, which did a lot to hinder, I would argue, political movements and political parties in the U.S., right? So, anti-communism in relation to the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Initially, socialist organizations and parties that preceded the DSA supported the struggle of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people. Shortly after, they became hostile to the Viet Minh, claiming it was decisively dominated by its Stalinist leadership and that it functioned as an instrument of Stalinist imperialism in Indochina. Those are two direct quotes from Harrington himself, right? And when Harrington was young, when he was part of the Young People's Socialist League, which was the youth wing of the Socialist Party of America, he was opposed to the war in Vietnam. He was sympathetic to the Viet Minh cause. He was elated when the Vietnamese were able to kick out the French, and angry at the U.S. for taking the French's side. But in his attempt to realign the Democratic Party, Harrington saw LBJ as a potential ally. So on the election of 1964, Harrington wrote in a News Politics article espousing support for LBJ over Barry Goldwater, even though he noted that both Lyndon B. Johnson and Goldwater favored war in Vietnam. Harrington justified his support by claiming that a Goldwater victory would lead to World War III. He considered LBJ the lesser evil on both domestic and foreign policy. So again, here we see one of his core fundamentals being the realignment strategy playing a central role in how he went about opposing communism, right? And that had to do with, even though LBJ is responsible for perpetrating the war in Vietnam, for sending U.S. troops, for napalm bombings, for chemical weapons bombings, all these sorts of things, for drafting young people, sending young people out to go fight in war. He didn't care about that. He was more focused on realigning the Democrats because he believed the Democrats had potential to pass policies that the socialist movement in America supported. So we continue. Harrington was disliked by radicals in the anti-war movement, even though he didn't support the war. And that's very important. Harrington did not support the war, okay? But I guess his political strategy is what made him tacitly a supporter of the war. And so the SDS supported an anti-war march in Washington, D.C. on April 21st. Harrington welcomed the march, but he took issue with the SDS's willingness to work with communists and Trotskyists. And that's because for Harrington, an anti-war movement could not welcome communists, break the law, or advance any revolutionary politics, primarily because he believed the involvement of radicals in the anti-war movement would alienate liberals and moderates. And one of his colleagues, which was also in the leadership of the Socialist Party of America, Norman Thomas, he welcomed any group or individual against the war. However, this is a big however, only those in favor of an, quote, independent peace movement, not committed to any form of totalitarianism or drawing inspiration from the foreign policy of any government, end quote. And so he believed that there were definite limits on how to protest against the war. And again, this to understand Harrington's positions, and how they manifested, it's not on whether he supported the war or not, rather how he went about opposing it. So he was against draft card burning and other tactics that could be perceived as violent or divisive, that could alienate liberals who he deemed to be more supportive or people that could be swayed for socialism, right? He was against the publishing of a poem that denounced U.S. democracy and endorsed Ho Chi Minh in the North Vietnam, because during a lot of anti-war marches, more radical attendees would read out a poem that was, espousing support for the Viet Minh, and he believed that, this could be misinterpreted as the anti-war movement supporting communism, right? But, despite Harrington's concerns, the march was an ultimate success and one of the largest anti-war protests in American history, okay? And the SDS estimated 3,000 people were to show up, but more than 25,000 people attended. The march and rally were also quite moderate in both their slogans and tactics, and omitted any form of civil disobedience or confrontation with the government. Embarrassed by their fears, confirmed to be unfounded, Norman Thomas and Harrington apologized. And, again, this is all, like his main thing regarding anti-communism. The main reason why he was such a strong proponent of it was because he refused to see LBJ as complicit in the war, as someone that could be swayed, right? And that's the realignment strategy in action, which we will get more into in section 3. So continuing on anti-communism in relation to the Vietnam War, in late 1965, Harrington wrote multiple articles for the Village Voice on communism and the anti-war movement. In those articles, he argued that the anti-war movement could only succeed if it disassociates itself from any hint of being apologists for the Viet Cong. Direct quote. If the anti-war movement didn't uphold anti-communism, it would continue to fuel the right-wing proclivities, quote, that peace-mongering and communism are one and the same thing, end quote. So Harrington and his ilk were irritated by radicals for waving flags of the communist-led South Vietnamese National Liberation Front as a sign of solidarity. He accused them of being agent provocateurs from the CIA. The logic was, what better way to equate peace activists as apologists for communism, right, than waving a flag supporting a communist movement for national liberation against their colonizer. This ideological and strategic difference between LID and the SDS proved to be irreconcilable leading to their formal split. So, people who venerated Harrington as like a very important figure in the socialist movement ended up splitting with him because they thought that his rabid anti-communism was over the top, that it was ridiculous, and that it was hindering their method of their strategies and tactics to oppose the war, and not just oppose the war, but also show solidarity with comrades, with people who they agree with their plight, which is, again, national liberation. And so Harrington says, quote, "I don't want to be thought that my attitude toward communism is determined by an opportunistic desire to be popular at all costs. I am anti-communist on principle because I am pro-freedom." And so that quote reveals how closely aligned Harrington was with the ideology of American exceptionalism and Western chauvinism. Again, something that a lot of young radicals from the anti-war movement despised. Me personally, if I didn't know who the quotee was, I would have thought it originated from some ghoul of the two-party duopoly. Like, I don't know what politicians from that time I could think of that would have said this quote, but I can imagine people today like Marco Rubio speaking about communism saying, "I'm anti-communism because I'm pro-freedom." And additionally, it wasn't just Vietnam, right? Harrington and other socialists of his ilk opposed third world national liberation movements in general, seeing them as potentially totalitarian because a lot of them tended to side with the Soviet Union. And that was, that wasn't a mere coincidence. It was because the Soviet Union was demonstrating solidarity financially and sometimes even through arms. So now, anti-communism in relation to Cuba, right? This was another third world national liberation movement. So as we can see here, in the 1972 Socialist Party of America convention, the Young People's Socialist League, the SPA's youth wing, stated that relations with Cuba depend on, quote, "some loosening of the bonds," unquote, end quote, of repression by Castro and the ending of Cuban aid to guerrilla movements in Latin America. They also noted that, quote, it does no good not to recognize the Castro regime, however regressive we consider it. American economic aid to Cuba would decrease its dependence on Russia and encourage more democratic political elements, end quote. So this rabid anti-communism from Harrington and the socialist groups he led or was involved with translated over into the political ideology of the DSA. It has influenced the left's foreign and domestic policy during that time, and even today, right, when it comes to the embargo. Its permeation into the left wing pacified radical elements of the socialist tradition in regards to strategy and tactics that would have assisted us then and now, right? And why do I say that? Well, because by supporting the very same rhetoric espoused by the government, as we see here, saying that the loosening of bonds of repression from the Castro regime, and also that they sent aid to guerrilla movements, aka supporters of terrorism, is what has kept them, one, on the terrorism list today, and two, what continues to fuel the rhetoric and the narrative that Cuba is some authoritarian hellscape, right, that oppresses the entire population. I mean, that's just silly, right? Like, that's all to detract from the fact that there is an embargo that is crippling, the Cuban people from accessing basic goods and commodities needed for survival, needed for development. And so, this alienated socialists from America, from socialist movements around the world that were successful and that demonstrated solidarity, demonstrated solidarity across the hemisphere, and across the entire globe. And again, this was all because of the realignment strategy, right? And trying to appeal to American voters and trying to appeal to American, managerial political class, right? Liberals, people of the Democratic Party. And this, the realignment strategy tames the left and erroneously purports that the Democratic Party can serve as a vehicle for political and economic reform to establish socialism, which, time has proved not to be true. And that's what we're going to get into in section 3. The DSA's realignment strategy in action. This is where, the strategy of lesser evilism plays out and, what its natural end result really is. political campaigning and the political campaign of Jesse Jackson. So in 1984, in the 1984 presidential election, the most visible, influential contingent of the DSA supported the conservative wings of the AFL-CIO and the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, Walter Mondale. Vying for the nomination against Mondale was the progressive Jesse Jackson and his Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson was arguably the closest the Democratic Party got to nominating a social democratic alternative, right? Jesse Jackson's campaign contained the hallmark of the realignment strategy that was viable for progressives ranging across a multiplicity of organizations in the country. And his Rainbow Coalition supported a pro-labor program and garnered support from progressives in the AFL-CIO. In addition, it enjoyed its strongest support within the black community, right? But guess what? The most notable figure of the DSA didn't endorse Jesse Jackson. Instead, he endorsed the Democratic Party establishment candidate, and that was Harrington supporting Walter Mondale. And the AFL-CIO and the DSA strategy of lesser evilism, epitomized in the slogan "Anybody but Reagan," utterly failed. I mean, Mondale lost, and immediately after, a coalition of prominent establishment Democrats blamed the party's failure on pandering to interest groups such as blacks and labor unions, and they argued that if the Dems wanted to make a political comeback, then they must convert to the party of big business, a euphemism for appealing to oligarchs. They had to become the party of doctors, pharmacists, stockbrokers, and professionals from the managerial class. So they effectively blamed Jackson's Rainbow Coalition for their defeat. How did the left respond to their sentiments? They echoed them, right? People, the DSA, members of the DSA, the organization, I don't want to say the entire organization, but definitely leadership, such as Harrington, they echoed them on their leftist news outlets that served as unofficial propaganda arms of the DSA, right? So progressives were scapegoated by the Dems, but unrelentingly, the DSA continued to pursue party unity, right? Those post-mortem events and the, quote, official story promulgated by the Democrats transitioned them further to the right, proving that they were never our friends. They were never the friends of the DSA or of socialists. But nonetheless, the DSA persisted, right? How could you say these people could be realigned for socialism when they're vouching to become the party of big business and other peoples of the managerial class? I mean, that's just silly. In the 1988 presidential election, the DSA had a change of heart and endorsed Jackson, albeit the Rainbow Coalition's new platform was lukewarm, right? It wasn't as progressive or as radical as it was in 1984. And the DSA arrived at supporting Jackson in an attempt to break racial barriers for the future presidential campaign. And it's funny also because this endorsement came behind closed doors, right? And it came behind closed doors because they wanted to make Jackson more palpable to the American public by not giving him direct ties to socialist organizations or socialist organizers. And so they endorsed him closed doors. Yet, the establishment Dem, Michael Dukakis, nonetheless won the primary. And immediately the DSA didn't hesitate to thrust their support for him. But, as we all know, Reagan won his re-election campaign, further bolstering right-wing elements in the Democratic Party, incrementally shifting the Dems further to the right. And to no avail, right? The Democratic Party establishment candidate still won, someone who by most people would have been considered to be moderate, that could appeal to a broad swath of American voters, and he still lost, right? So instead of the DSA influencing the Democrats, the Democrats influenced the DSA because they were continued to be dragged along into supporting such candidates that were moderate, right? That were moderate and also tied to the same interests that the Republican Party was tied to. And so now political and campaigning in more contemporary times, in 2004, the DSA urged their members to support John Kerry. John Kerry being the former Secretary of State to Obama after Hillary Clinton. Interestingly enough, Kerry, although a staunch opponent to the Vietnam War, He even testified in a Senate committee against the Vietnam War, against war crimes in the Vietnam War. Under Obama, he later became a war hawk. And prior to being the Secretary of State, he supported the invasion of Iraq and the wanton bombing of Libya. And so here you could see where the DSA, which interestingly, they've actually deleted this from the archives on their website, they urge support for Kerry, as the headline reads, Socialists urge support for John Kerry. And I mean, they admit that they see shortcomings with John Kerry and his platform, but nonetheless, I mean, again, saw him as a lesser evil. They believe that the impending threat of fascism within the Republican Party was more important to fight against than fighting for our own platform, our own program, our own policies, right? And continuing with that, I mean, Obama was invited to speak at a forum organized by the DSA in 1996. So I couldn't find a lot of details about this forum, but it was like a community organizing forum. As you can see right here, here's the flyer, and his name appears right there. And so at this town meeting where they were going to be discussing like economic security and community organizing, whatever, Obama was invited to speak, right? And why would you invite to speak someone who you don't tacitly support or agree with, you know? And we all know who Obama later became to be, right? As president of the U.S. We all know the crimes that Obama committed. I mean, you know, the bombing of Libya, right? The bombings in Western Africa, drone strikes in Western Africa, continued operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah, I mean, it was just, he was a total warmonger, and someone who as being a proponent of imperialism did nothing to further the socialist cause. And even in 1996, I mean, Chicago's DSA endorsed Obama, right? And again, the DSA supported Obama in 2008. And I mean, I don't mean that they formally endorsed him, you know, but still they had organizers and members encouraged to join his campaign, right? But, you know, later in 2016, we saw a slight improvement in who socialists and more specifically the DSA were supporting in mainstream politics. And that was Bernie Sanders, right? Who had a great program, a lot of things that many of us could agree with as socialists, like Medicare for all, free public university education, or free public education in general, things like a Green New Deal, great policies, right, that could begin to take the U.S. in the right direction. However, immediately after his defeat, they shifted to never Trumpism, right? And we saw that we needed to throw support behind Hillary because Trump was so dangerous. And although at the time no one really knew how dangerous Trump would be, again, it was that same argument of lesser evilism, that there's this impending threat of fascism or authoritarianism coming from the right wing that must be combated with the lukewarm, closer to being right wing politics of the Democrats, which have never amounted to anything in the favor of a socialist movement. And I mean, like Bernie, like again in 2020, the DSA supported him. You know, again he ran a pretty good campaign. However, soon after his defeat, they turned to Biden under a similar banner, which was anybody but Trump. And they didn't formally endorse him, like I said, but still, you know, organizers and volunteers and stuff that were socialists were encouraged to campaign for Biden because, you know, impending threat of fascism from Trump, which has just proven not to be true. I mean, as we all know, I would argue that Obama was a better Bush in terms of furthering Bush's agenda. Like Obama claimed to be anti-war, but he was anti-war in the sense that he wasn't pro-war and sending troops or invading countries like Bush did. He was more so in favor of war through covert operations, like the bombing of, you know, of Libya, like I said before, bombings in Africa, drone strikes in Africa, bombings in the Middle East. I mean, these continued after Bush through Obama. And then with Trump, same thing. I mean, Trump dropped the Moab. I'm pretty sure it was in Afghanistan, the mother of all bombs, which hadn't been dropped in years until Trump did it. Right. So they've all been piggybacking on each other's policies, and like, you know, also by like heightening the new Cold War against China and Russia, and then continuing to warmonger over this threat that the U.S. is going to be overtaken by authoritarian or totalitarian systems from the East. And yeah, so as we see, like the realignment strategy has really led to us compromising a lot of our ideals, specifically when it comes to imperialism, right? Like even with Bernie, like as good as a platform that Bernie had, you know, Bernie supported the bombings of Yugoslavia in the 90s. You could have your reservations about Yugoslavia all you want, but that doesn't mean that they deserve to be bombed by NATO. I mean, what the heck was NATO doing in Yugoslavia? What threat did Yugoslavia really pose to any countries in Europe? And so, you know, another example is right now, recently, Bernie voted to expand NATO in Congress, you know, in the Senate. And Rand Paul didn't even vote for it, didn't even vote for that bill, right? And I'm pretty sure Josh Hawley also didn't vote against it, or another Republican, I can't remember their name. But why is Bernie supporting, you know, expanding a warmongering institution, military alliance that should have already been considered to be defunct, you know, since the fall of the Soviet Union? And I mean, it's again like NATO continues to instigate war. You know, it continues to cause destabilization in the region through its expansion, as we see right now with the war against Russia, its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. And so, again, the strategy of realigning the Democratic Party is like the DSA's white whale. It's like something that, you know, is never going to be achieved because, again, we're just going to end up continuing to compromise our own platform and program in favor of a socialist transformation. You know, and like there are like obviously locally the DSA has endorsed and campaigned for its own members, which is something that we should continue to support and something we should continue to do rather than supporting the Democrats. And a great example from our state here in Florida is Richie Floyd, right? Richie Floyd was a campaign that was run by the DSA. He ran as a DSA candidate and he won. And that was, you know, very successful. And I don't know too much about Richie Floyd's platform, but I definitely do support, and I do think that we should continue to run campaigns in that way, independently of the Democratic Party, because it allows us to separate ourselves, substantively separate ourselves from establishment parties that so many Americans hate, right? The Democrats and the Republicans are both very unpopular. And so if we can begin to differentiate ourselves through popular class-based policies, you know, that are universal in who they're helping, then we should, right? It's important. That's what voters want. They're tired of the two-party duopoly. They want something new. They want something different. And socialism can offer that, and not only offer it in rhetoric, but offer it in implementation, in its outcome, and what it seeks to do in transforming society.
The post-2015 boom. So we've talked a lot about DSA's history, a lot about we've talked about its founding. We've talked about some of the views of the founding members, some of the actions of the organization since its founding, though we have not touched yet upon one of perhaps the most important event or time period in the DSA's history. So since the merger of DSOC and NAM in 1982 to form the DSA, up until 2015, the membership of the DSA really only oscillated between 5,000 and 10,000 members for practically 30 years, almost about 35 years. However, in 2015, Bernie Sanders' campaign for president, subsequently followed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's election in 2018, has led to an explosion in interest for, in national interest for socialism, and specifically the Democratic Socialist movement. This has led DSA's numbers to explode from roughly 5,000 to 10,000 members all the way up to 100,000 nationwide members, with a local chapter structure that is almost entirely new to the organization. Many committees have been formed since the post-2015 boom that perhaps wouldn't have been formed in the past. We've talked about some of the views of the founders and of the early DSA, and honestly, many of those views wouldn't allow for such committees as the BDS organization to be formed and be such a prominent national aspect of the DSA. In addition, there has been efforts to push towards an ending, or not necessarily an ending, but at least a critique of the realignment strategy. refusing to work strictly within electoral confines and to build worker power outside of the confines of the electoral system. So we see in the past 7 years, which relatively speaking is not that long of a time, especially given that the organization existed for a full 35 years before that. Much of the work that has been done by DSA members stands almost in stark contrast to the DSA's earlier history. This leads us to question, just how up for interpretation what it means to be a DSA member is in 2022 and beyond.
So in terms of our conclusions and takeaways from having done this study into the history of DSA, I think the main one is that the principles and strategy of the early DSA members has led DSA to repeat many of the same mistakes of the SPA. And given what we had just read or what had just been presented on 2015 and the membership boom and the surge of young members has represented a turning point in the organization where a lot of the old mistakes of DSA, basically there's no reason that we have to continue these mistakes, and we can start moving to correct them. And a lot of these mistakes have been corrected. This surge in membership, turning DSA into like truly mass organization, has resulted in some turns away from its past. For instance, pulling the DSA out of the Socialist International, which had explicitly capitalistic, neoliberal parties in it, like the Labour Party of the UK. Also, its rejection of a kind of Zionist approach or stance towards Palestine, and so on. However, there are still a lot of political mistakes that continue to this day that need to continue to be studied and discussed frankly and criticized, and studies towards how we can correct them need to continue to be made. So some of the takeaways that we have for the Miami chapter in particular at this time are that we have to work to end the realignment strategy and rethink DSA's electoral strategy on completely independent lines. DSA must become the political party of the working class, free from the interests of the capitalist class. We must take up theoretical and ideological study, development, and discussion as a priority, with the aim of forming ideological unity on questions of principle. Without unity on questions of principle, our organization cannot lead the working class movement effectively. And we can't keep pushing difficult questions aside in hopes that they'll go away. This effort to try to preserve peace and a formal unity within the organization, that just lays the groundwork for future splits and for stagnation and for constantly going with the tactics that will, or strategies and tactics that will appease the most number of members, which aren't always necessarily the most effective, unless you work to create that unity prior to putting forward that tactic or strategy. Another thing is that we need to re-examine the DSA's program and bylaws in light of its history and in light of these criticisms, to see where the vestiges of the Harrington years have left their mark. And from there, we have to see how we'd like to change and the DSA to help improve it and to help it become the leading organization of the working class movement. Another thing is that we must continue this critical examination of the history of the socialist and working class movement on all levels, internationally, domestically, and of this organization, DSA in particular, to find answers to the burning questions of the socialist movement now.
Thank you for taking the time to enjoy our presentation. We're super happy that that we have an audience for this and for this information to be shared. We will be developing these ideas further and examining how the DSA looks like today. Much of today's presentation was examining strictly the history of the DSA, though we did touch on some of the modern aspects and factors that will need to be analyzed within the DSA. So we will be following up this presentation with a DSA today. Thank you.